Right, we're recording. And I want to finish talking about eukaryote biodiversity, just the sheer number of different types of eukaryotes that are out there. As a review, I've mentioned that we have the Animalia, the Plantae, and the Fungi, which are mostly multicellular and mostly show some degree of cell differentiation. We talked about what that is, different types of cell specialized to do different things. The simplest animals might have fewer than 10 different cell types. You have roughly 200, but it's the same idea regardless. And then the fourth kingdom, the Protista, is not a very good way of classifying things because it doesn't have any, how do I want to put this? It's defined on what it isn't. It's all eukaryotes that aren't animals, plants, or fungi. Okay, Kirsten, no problem if you got kicked out. I'll just keep adding people. I know sometimes that happens. Yeah, so fungi are, many of them are single-celled, like the one that you see at the lower right. This is not a really strict definition, but most of them don't show much in the way of cell differentiation. But still, it's not good form to classify things based on what they aren't rather than what they are. So Animalia, Plantae, fungi, and other is pretty much how we classify eukaryotes. The pros divide up Protista in various ways that we don't have time for. Take my Biology 4401 course if you really want to know. Right. So I've said all I'm going to about the Protista. Now I want to talk about the fungi. And if you look at fungi under a microscope, what they typically look like is this. Most fungi are just a mass of filaments. And each filament is called a hypha, Hypha, plural hyphae. Typically, each hypha is made up of many cells, and the whole thing is surrounded by a cell wall. Now, I talked about typical bacteria are surrounded by a cell wall that at least partially is made of some stuff called peptidoglycan. Fungal cell walls are made up of something different. It's a complex carbohydrate called chitin. Yeah, spelled chitin, but we pronounce it chitin. That's what makes up the cell walls of fungi. And if you have a mass of hyphae, you can see in the previous slide, these hyphae are growing together, and you can see over here how they're branching. So as each hypha grows, it will typically branch off, and you end up with a whole network of hyphae. And a massive network of hyphae is called a mycelium. And you have all seen a mycelium if you've ever seen food go bad, like digging around in the back of the fridge and opening that container of old Chinese takeout or whatever it is and finding that it's covered in kind of bluish fuzzy stuff or white cottony stuff or whatever it is that's growing on your food. Odds are that cottony fuzzy stuff was a big fungal mycelium. If you've ever had mold, let's say on the, in your shower, those patches of, dark fuzzy stuff on, in your shower might well be a fungus mycelium. So you might look up and say, hey, there's a mycelium on my ceiling. And I can't see or hear you, but I'm imagining everybody laughing uproariously at my incredible wit. Right. There's a humongous number of fungi in soils. And a mycelium might grow through soil. Most fungi are decomposers, so they will grow into dead animals, dead leaves, even dead wood, and penetrate and slowly break down all of these things. Where you're likeliest to see fungi is when you have fungi in soil or sometimes in dead wood or occasionally in live wood. And the mycelium will grow, and the mycelium may be very big, but it may be virtually invisible. But every so often you will get hyphae that will start kind of webbing together, forming thicker strands, and the strands come together to make larger strands, and the larger strands come together to make even larger strands, and they bud into reproductive structures that are called sporocarps. You're looking at a home mushroom farm from the side, and all of that cottony stuff down below the surface of the soil is hyphae making a mycelium. And hopefully you can see how those thin white strands kind of web together to become thicker and thicker. And those web strands come together to make these little buttons that are sticking up out of the soil. Those buttons are baby mushrooms. And mushrooms are the most familiar type of sporocarp. And again, sporocarps have to do with reproduction, and I'll show you, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So you can have mycelia in soils that can be really, really big, but they're only detectable by the sporocarps that they send up above the ground. At least they're only detectable in with the naked eye by looking for sporocarps that they send up above the ground. This is called a fairy ring because it was believed that these would grow in the rings where fairies would have their nightly ring dances. Fairies would dance around in a ring, and these mushrooms would grow up where they were doing it. Because according to Black Sabbath, fairies wear boots, and you've got to believe it. It's a really good song. Anyway, the reason why you've got a whole bunch of mushrooms sprouting in a ring is that under this whole round area of soil, all in here, you have a mycelium. You have a network of these microscopic hyphae. Each one might only be, 10, 20 microns wide. Each one's thinner than a human hair, but they'd be growing through all of this area and branching and rebranching and breaking down, dead leaves and dead roots and any dead stuff in the soil. And, sending out branches to grow out even farther, maybe like that. And then at the very edge of that mycelium is where the thing will send up mushrooms. So there's a mycelium under this patch of soil that might be, 10 feet across. But the only evidence of it above ground are these fairy rings. These aren't that uncommon. I've seen them, especially driving around the older parts of Conway. They often, they'll come up after a rain on the lawns of some of the older houses around here. That's where you tend to get fairy rings. By the way, I'm not sure what species of mushroom these are. If anybody is curious, no, they're probably not the psychedelic type. Around here, the most common species of mushroom that I've seen making fairy rings is called Chlorophyllum molybdites, which you don't want to eat because its common name is the vomiter mushroom. That's one of the ones that will not kill you. It will just make you wish you were dead because your digestive system will empty out in both directions for about 24 hours if you eat one. Okay, anyway, the largest known living thing in the world happens to be a fungal mycelium. This aerial photo doesn't show it, but it shows a relative. This is a photo of a forest in Montana, and you can see these light patches. There's one, there's one up here. There's one right there. Those are areas of damage to trees. And the trees have been damaged by a fungus infestation, a mycelium growing through the soil, growing from root to root to root of trees, and taking nutrients from them and feeding on the tree's food and prospering at the tree's expense. And each one of those big patches is about 20 acres in size. If anybody does not know how big an acre is, think of a football field, an American football, gridiron football field, cut off the end zones and cut 5 yards from what's left. So a football field from one 5-yard line to the other 5-yard line, that's an acre. And each one of those big patches is about 20 acres in size, and each one is caused by one mycelium. The largest living thing in the world is a mycelium found in the Malheur National Forest in Oregon that covers 2,200 acres, which works out to be more than 6 UCA campuses. So there is a humongous fungus among us. But nobody can ever see the whole thing, because what it is one of these masses of microscopic filaments spreading through the soil. You could never actually see it all because there's no way to take something like that out of the soil, but it's basically just a giant version of the same kind of cottony stuff that you got on the takeout food that you let go bad in the back of the fridge. Same basic idea. So there. On the other hand, there are some fungi that don't form hyphae, or at least they might form hyphae for part of their life cycle and then switch to a single-celled stage. Each one of these oval things that you're looking at is a single cell, and these are called yeasts. A yeast is just a non-hyphal fungus that grows in a single-celled form. Probably the best known yeast is baker's yeast that you would add to, that you put in your bread to get it to rise. There's lots of yeast that's used in bread making, if any of you do that. This is a picture, by the way. I didn't take this, but I used to see this because I think I told you I used to be a volunteer lab tech in the Berkeley Free Clinic back a long, long time ago when grunge was still a thing. And that is a stained slide of vaginal discharge, which is something we used to see a lot of. And what you can see in here is these very dark staining, these really dark blue. You have some that look like this. I'm circling them right now. Actually, here, I'm going to go to a more visible color. So things that look like this, things look like those little footballs right there. Those are single-celled yeast forms. And then these elongated ones right up here that I'm tracing out, those are hyphae. This is an organism called Candida albicans that actually switches between hyphal growth and single-celled growth. So this is a fungus that can grow in both ways. So here's a nice long hypha right there. And then up here, you get some of the single-celled yeast forms. And this is the causative agent of vaginal yeast infections. They can also cause a disease that newborns often get called thrush. which looks like little discolored whitish patches inside the mouth. It's a very common thing that babies get, usually quite easily treatable. It's not a humongous deal, but yeah, that's another context in which you might find a disease-causing yeast. Some fungi don't have sex, but many of them do. And what usually happens when they do is you have two hyphae that come together, like the beetle said, and fuse and make a new hypha. And this is a couple of them. This is one hypha on the left and another one on the right in the process of swelling up and coming together. And I should mention that fungi don't have sexes as we think of them. They have mating types, but the mating types don't look any different from each other. There's no way of defining one of these as male and the others as female. So they're usually just called plus and minus, or sometimes type A and type alpha or something like that. But there's no way to define which one is the male and which is the female. They're just hyphae. And when two hyphae come together, they make a new hypha that contains DNA, the genetic material from both parents. There, those are the hyphae in the process of coming together. And that hypha that contains DNA from both parents, called a sexual hypha, might grow for a bit, and then it starts dividing and producing many single-celled stages called spores. So up here on the left, that's a sexual hypha with a big cluster of spores at the tip. And on the right, you can see a picture taken with a different type of microscope called a scanning electron microscope, showing you the sexual hyphae and then a whole cluster of these oval-shaped spores that bud off the sexual hypha, fall off. They might drift through the air for quite some distance and ultimately will sprout, if you like, into new hyphae, and round goes this great circle of life, and it moves us all. Okay, in some species, like in black bread mold, for example, the sexual hypha just grows and then produces spores. In fact, black bread mold is what you're looking at right here. But in many species, it's the sexual hypha that will divide and divide and divide, branch and web together, and ultimately produce the sporocarp, aka the fruiting body is another term for it. And this is the most familiar part of a fungus that you're going to see. So you presumably know mushrooms. Mushrooms are the most common type of sporocarp. Some of them absolutely delicious, some of them deadly poisonous. And by the way, if anybody's curious, there's no simple rule to tell you what mushrooms are poisonous and what mushrooms aren't. You just have to learn to recognize the edible species, but there's no single character that you could use to tell them all apart. Or as we like to say, every mushroom is edible once. Only some of them are edible more than once. Right. Anyway, so that's the most familiar type of sporocarp. I took this picture a few years ago on a tree in Laurel Park. If you know that park, if you went from UCA to Conway Regional Hospital and then kept going behind the hospital and crossed Robinson, you'd find Laurel Park. I used to go there all the time when my kid was younger, before he discovered video games, damn it. And these were a bunch growing on a tree. These are called bracket fungi or shelf fungi, looking like little shelves sticking out of the wood. These can actually cause disease in living trees, but they're also very common on dead wood. You can also find there are fungi with underground sporocarps. Those are called truffles. Black truffles are a gourmet delicacy and extremely expensive. Coral fungi are another type you might have seen. They can look like little fingers sticking up out of the ground. Puffballs, morels, jelly fungi, things like that. There's lots of different types of sporocarp out there. Okay, checking the chat. Oh, someone was asking, was it closer to the hospital or closer to the bathrooms? That tree was pretty close to the bathrooms. It may have been one of the ones that they've cut down. The last time I was there, they'd cut down several trees, and this might have been one of them. Not all fungi can do this, but some of these bracket fungi can actually cause disease to the tree and weaken the wood, which might have been why they took it down. I honestly don't know. But I know you can see this kind of thing on living in dead trees all over the place. There's a lot of them growing on dead wood in the nature reserve, for example, which you should get to see in a few weeks if you have not already been there. Right. Anyway, fungi that don't reproduce sexually are known as imperfect fungi, because I guess your life is imperfect if you're not having sex. Whoa, flashback to high school. Dang. Anyway, the ones that you would know that are imperfect fungi include the fungi that cause things like athlete's foot, ringworm, which is not actually a worm. It's a fungus infection of your skin that happens to make these ring-shaped red rashes. Jock itch is caused by an imperfect fungus. Another one that you might see is green bread mold. Green bread mold is a fungus that doesn't reproduce sexually, or at least we've never caught it, and it's green and it grows on bread. I'm assuming you have seen green bread mold before. Okay, great. Now, athlete's foot and ringworm are annoying, but they're not medically serious. There's only one person who has ever died of jock itch, and that was Captain Hook. But fungi that get deeper into the body is not that common in healthy people, but it can be extremely dangerous in people whose immune systems are damaged, people who are, as we say, immunocompromised. What you're looking at here is a stained sample of sputum, which is the medical term for the stuff you hack up out of your lungs. And all of these little black circles right here, every one of those is a yeast cell in the species Pneumocystis urevechii. And this is particularly notorious for causing pneumonia in patients with HIV. If you're infected with HIV, that's a virus. We will talk later about exactly what viruses are and what they do, but I'll just say right now that the HIV virus doesn't kill you. What it does is weaken your immune system so that you can't defend against a lot of disease-causing agents that you'd normally be able to fight off. And so a lot of people with full-blown AIDS have died not from the HIV virus, but from this yeast, which grows in the lungs and causes a very severe form of pneumonia. Pneumonia that, people with healthy immune systems can probably shake right off, but people with weakened immune systems often can't. So getting fungi growing deep in your body is often very dangerous. But there's lots of fungi that are very useful to humans. Yeast in particular break down sugar to create alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. So if you take a bunch of yeasts and you add them to a sweet solution made from grain, a solution called malt, the yeast will break down the sugar, turn it into alcohol and carbon dioxide gas, and your malt solution becomes beer. You can do the same adding yeast to some bread dough that you've added sugar to, and the yeast will break the sugar down into carbon dioxide gas, which makes your bread rise, and alcohol, which is usually driven off when you bake your dough and make it into bread. In theory, you could get drunk by eating massive amounts of bread dough. I don't recommend it. You'd make yourself sick before you felt any effects from the alcohol. So don't do it. But that's why you add yeast to bread recipes. The carbon dioxide gas is what puts the bubbles in your bread dough and makes your bread rise and makes it light and fluffy and not basically a cracker. Of course, there's edible mushrooms, like that porcini mushroom on the right, which is a delicacy and unfortunately does not grow in Arkansas, but I know some of the edible ones that do. Mushrooms and truffles we've mentioned. There are other foods that use fungus to ferment them, notably soy sauce, which is basically soybean extract fermented by a fungus. Miso, this ingredient, especially in Japanese soups. Fungi are deliberately added to products like blue cheese. The bluish stuff growing in blue cheese is a fungus that is edible and gives the blue cheese its unique flavor. There's fungus growing on brie cheese as well. And again, that changes the texture and also the flavor of the cheese. There's even fungi that are commercially grown to produce this protein-rich meat substitute. I took this picture at one of the Krogers in town. I can't remember which, but this fungally produced meat substitute is sold under the name Quorn. I confess I've never tried these, but if anybody ever wants to try Quorn chicken nuggets, or Quorn chicken patties, let me know. It's perfectly edible and high in protein and supposed to taste okay. Last but not least, fungi produce a number of antibiotics, especially fungi that grow in soil. Antibiotics, of course, are substances that kill or stop the growth of bacteria. Probably the most famous is penicillin, which comes from a common green mold. It was discovered accidentally. A guy named Alexander Fleming was growing bacteria in a dish, and he wasn't very neat, and some fungus got into the dish with the bacteria. And he was about to throw the dish away when he noticed that the fungus was stopping the bacteria from growing. And that ultimately led to the penicillin family of antibiotics. There's other antibiotics, streptomycin's technically not fungus. There's several other antibiotics that are derived from fungi. So is the first immunosuppressive drug that was used in the 70s to make organ transplants possible, a drug called cyclosporin. A lot of drugs have come from fungi. So yeah, and then of course there is the famous mushroom that buys everybody drinks. You've heard of a mushroom who buys everybody drinks? He's a fun guy to be with. Okay, I'm imagining everybody laughing uproariously. So that's what I've got to say about Kingdom Fungi. What about Kingdom Plantae? What about the plants? Almost all plants are photosynthetic, and they're able to capture solar energy through some beautiful chemistry that we just haven't got time for. But to do it, they use a green pigment called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is what makes plants look green. The only exceptions to the rule that plants are photosynthetic is there are actually a few parasitic plants out there, and I'll show you one that you can find around here in just a minute. The cell walls of a plant are not made of peptidoglycan or chitin. They're made out of a different complex carbohydrate called cellulose. Cellulose is basically what wood is made of and paper is made of. If you've got a sheet of paper handy, it's mostly cellulose. When a plant cell is small, the cell wall is very thin and can stretch. But when the plant cell reaches its mature size, the cell wall thickens and the plant cell can never increase in size again. And this kind of puts some limits on the ways in which plants can grow. For example, trees grow at the tips. Once you have a tree trunk in place, that trunk can never get any longer. And if you have a tree trunk with a branch that is 5 feet off the ground, that branch can never get any higher off the ground because there's no way for all of the cells in the lower part of the tree trunk to get any longer than they already are, because they are literally boxed in with that cellulose cell wall. Most plants grow from the tip. There's a few that don't, like grass, for example, where the grass leaves grow from the base, which is why you have to keep mowing them. But anyway, that cellulose cell wall puts some limits on how plants can grow. And in most plants, there can be many plant cells that are functioning but dead. All they consist of is an empty cell wall, but there's no longer any living cell inside. There's no longer anything in it to do metabolism or anything like that. And I'll show you examples coming up soon. And anyway, surrounding external cells, plants have a waxy layer called a cuticle that reduces loss of water. On some leaves, the cuticle is very thick. If you ever pick up a magnolia leaf, you can scrape it with your thumbnail and you'll actually scrape off little flakes of wax. There are some plants where the wax is so thick you can harvest it and use it to make candles. If anybody's ever seen candles made out of stuff called bayberry. Bayberry is a plant that happens to have such thick waxy cuticles that you can harvest them and make candles out of them. But even plants that where you can't see that have a noticeable cuticle. You don't have to worry about what all of these are called, but what you're looking at in this picture is a slice through a leaf, edge on. So this up here is the top surface of the leaf, and it's made up of one type of cell. These are called epidermal cells. On the underside of the leaf, you have epidermal cells again, and you also have a few cells right here that let carbon dioxide gas into the leaf, and those are called guard cells. Below the epithelial cells, you have a layer of what's called palisade mesophyll with these very elongated cells. Then below it, you have these kind of irregular cells with a lot of air spaces in between called the spongy mesophyll. And whoops. And in the middle of it, making up these veins, you have these big empty cells that are called xylem cells. Don't memorize those names or positions unless you really, really want to, but I'm not going to test you on it. What I want you to see is that this is what cell differentiation means. Even in one cross-sectional view of one lousy little leaf, you have what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 different cell types. And of course, there are more specialized cell types in the roots, for example. So that's what we mean by plants being multicellular and showing cell differentiation. One that I sometimes see around here is that a plant that is not photosynthetic is called dodder. I've seen that growing on the shrubs in the pasture of one of my neighbors. I live kind of towards the country, not quite in it, kind of somewhere lost in the no man's land between Conway and Valonia. And every so often I'll see this growing in the pasture that I drive past on my way to work. This stuff that looks like golden spaghetti is a plant called dodder, and it's not photosynthetic. It's not green, and it has lost the ability to do this photosynthesis, this harvesting of light energy to grow. Instead, what it does is penetrate into host plants and take their nutrients directly. This is a plant that's a parasite, and this frequently does, in fact, kill the host plant. And again, this is not one that every one of you have seen, but it is one that I can see in my neighborhood most years. So it's something you might look out for if you're ever driving around in the wasteland between Conway and Valonia. Right. The vast majority of plants are, remember that we introduced this word last lecture, they're autotrophs, self-feeders, meaning that they get all of the energy and all of the elements, all of the schnapps, etc., that they need from water, carbon dioxide gas, and a few nutrients that they take from the soil, and they're able to power all of their metabolism on energy that they harvest from the sun. As a comic strip I once saw put it, the reason plants never get fat is because they are light eaters. Get it? Light, eat, like they eat light. Eaters of light, eat. Okay. I was amused. That's the important thing, right? And to do this, plants use a green substance called chlorophyll. Technically, it's a mixture of 2 slightly different types called chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Okay, thank you, Kylie, for saying it was kind of funny. We don't really need to worry about why they use 2 slightly different types. What you're looking at here is a diagram of a chlorophyll molecule. Each one of these angles is an atom of carbon because carbon is so common in organic chemistry that we often just leave it out of these diagrams. So every one of these angles right here represents an atom of carbon. You can see there's nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and 1 atom of magnesium for flavor. And we don't need to know how it works for our purposes here, but chlorophyll is what actually does the work of absorbing light energy and converting it into chemical energy that runs metabolism. So that chemical energy that's picked up by chlorophyll is used to take carbon dioxide gas, CO2, and water, H2O, and combine them into molecules of a type of sugar called glucose. Glucose you may have heard of. If you have too much glucose in your blood, you may have a condition like diabetes. But your body uses glucose as a fuel anyway. Glucose can be used to build up more complex sugars, to build molecules like cellulose, or as fuel for the plant to run its metabolism on. What you're looking at in this picture is a maple tree, probably up in the state of Vermont. It's had a little spigot called a spile hammered into the bark. And what's dripping out of it is a sugar-rich liquid. It's basically water containing glucose and more complicated sugars. That's called maple sap. And maple sap gets boiled down until it's very thick and you get maple syrup. And I picked this just because it shows as concretely as I can glucose and other more complex sugars made from glucose that have been produced inside this sugar maple tree by photosynthesis and are now in the winter being tapped into by maple syrup makers. All right. Incidentally, a lot of plants contain other pigments. Certainly plants like coleus, for example, you'll see red in those leaves as well as green. There's a whole family of yellow pigments in plants that are called xanthophylls. Orange pigment in plants are called carotenoids. And yes, that comes from the word carrot, because carrots contain lots of carotenoids. And then red and blue pigments are called anthocyanins. Some of these can color parts of a plant other than leaves, like carrots or sweet potatoes. Some of them will color flowers. And some of them are present in leaves, but they may not be visible until the plant shuts down for the year and breaks down the chlorophyll inside its leaves. When certain plants do this, they break down the chlorophyll, so they lose the green, and now the other pigments become visible. And this is what's happening here in the fall foliage. This is why leaves turn colors in the fall. The chlorophyll is breaking down, and the other pigments can now be seen. And then some plants don't have much in the way of other pigments, and those leaves just turn brown. But some of the trees that we get in places like the Ozarks have lots of these additional pigments, and their color change can be quite spectacular. Okay, there's some more plant tissue, and each one of these boxes is a cell, and I'm outlining one of them right there. Mature plant cells are surrounded by a cell wall that's made of a carbohydrate called cellulose. By the way, when you eat cellulose, it's called dietary fiber. And in many plants, there can be a second substance called lignin that links cellulose molecules together and makes an extremely tough and strong network. Wood is basically a whole bunch of cell walls that are made of cellulose, but strengthened and thickened with this lignin stuff. And that's what makes wood very tough and very hard. This happens to be a slice through the root of a buttercup. All of these plants have cell walls made of cellulose, and the cellulose cell walls are staining kind of green, but the cells with lignin in the cell walls are staining pink. And so you can see on the inside of this buttercup root, there's this cross-shaped arrangement of cells that carry water that have very thick cell walls that are staining pink. And that's why you're seeing this pink X in the middle of a bunch of green, which reminds me of something I saw at a Grateful Dead show once. But all of those cells have cell walls of cellulose, but some have lignin, making the cell wall much tougher and thicker and much more woody. On the other hand, very flexible parts of a plant like flower petals, those cells would have very, very thin cellulose cell walls. So it's the thickness of the cell wall and the presence of lignin that makes the difference between a plant part that's very floppy, like a thin, soft leaf, or the petal of a flower, or very, very stiff, like wood. In many plant tissues, the cells actually die when the tissue is mature. What you're looking at here is a picture of a plant tissue called cork. This is tissue from the outer bark of a Spanish species of oak tree. And this outer layer of cork can actually be peeled off of the oak tree. And the oak tree, if you do it right and you don't damage the center of the oak tree, the oak will regrow a new layer of cork. So this is renewable. And then, of course, this cork layer gets made into, wine corks. Tiny pieces of it can be glued together and make cork board and things like that. And the thing is that when cork is mature, it's dead. And it looks like this. You just have these empty spaces surrounded by cell walls. There's no living tissue left here. So those cells all died when the cork layer matures, and all that was left behind was these empty cell walls. By the way, it was an English scientist named Robert Hooke, who was one of the first to develop compound microscopes, who was looking at a slice of cork back in the 1500s and noticed that it was made up of these empty spaces, and they reminded him of very small rooms, and he called them cells. So if you're wondering why we call these units of life cells, it's because in cork, they looked like the cells of a monastery or the cells of a prison, or at least they did to Robert Hooke. I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but if anybody's curious as to why we call these things cells and not something else, that's why. Okay, this happens to be a slice right down the center of a plant stem, and at the very tip of the plant stem, there's a very small zone where the cells have very thin cell walls and they're actively dividing. An area like that where cells are actively dividing is called a meristem. And this particular one, because it's at the tip of a stem, is the apical meristem. And it's only here that cells are actually dividing and increasing in number. If you were to look at the cells down in here, they would have gotten longer, but they would eventually they'd stop, and the stem can no longer get any longer because these now have mature cell walls that can't stretch. By the way, apical meristems are usually surrounded by several layers of immature leaves, making a bud. So you're not, without carefully dissecting it, you're not going to see a bare apical meristem just waving around in the breeze. They tend to be surrounded by immature leaves to make buds. So if you've ever seen a bud on a tree branch in spring, the little leaflets that make up the bud are wrapped around the apical meristem and protecting it. By the way, over here, you can see a lateral meristem. If you were to cut off the apical meristem, the lateral meristem would start growing and produce a new stem. And maybe you'd get another apical meristem growing right here. This is why if you grow an herb like basil and you break off the tips of the stems, you get a plant that becomes more bushy. Come to think of it, this is the rationale behind pruning. If you've got a shrub and you keep cutting off the tips of the branches, you remove these apical meristems, and the lateral meristems start growing, and your plant gets more full and more bushy looking. So that's the idea behind pruning. That's why Physical Plant sends out people with electric hedge trimmers to shape the bushes every so often. It's not just to give them a shape, it's to make them grow bushier and more branchy looking and more full. So there, never let it be said I don't teach useful knowledge. I'm not going to say much about plant classification, but for our purposes, we can talk about two main types of plant. There are some plants that don't have specialized cell types that transport water, and we call these bryophytes. Far and away, the most familiar type of bryophytes are mosses. And since mosses don't have these tissues that transport water, bryophytes can't get very big. Bryophytes do not grow into trees. And bryophytes are mostly found in moist areas, patches of moist soil, maybe, tree trunks in moist areas. But they tend not to do very well where the soil is very dry because they don't have any way of taking water. Meandria, you all right? Sorry, you just sent me a message that consisted of nothing but zeros. Did your finger slip? Okay, I'm not going to worry about it, but I hope. I don't know, did she fall asleep and have her, finger hit the zero? It's all right. I've had that happen before. Okay, no worries. So anyway, because bryophytes can't take water out of the soil and transport it any long distance, they can't get big. And most of them grow in moist areas, places where, conditions are already pretty wet. Almost all of the plants that you're familiar with, basically all of the plants that aren't mosses, are called tracheophytes. And another term for these is vascular plants. Vascular, by the way, comes from the Latin word for a vessel. It's used in medicine. A vascular surgeon, for example, is someone who specializes in operating on blood vessels. A vascular surgeon might fix your varicose veins, for example. And even though they don't have blood, vascular plants have specialized cells that transport water and nutrients throughout the plant. So a tree, for example, can take water out of the soil and transport it. If it's a California dawn redwood, it can transport that water 300 feet above the surface of the ground. Even smaller trees can transport water quite a long distance away from the roots because they have vascular tissue that transports water and transports nutrients throughout the plant. So the sugars that the leaves are making can go to the roots to keep them alive. And the water that the roots are sucking up can go to the leaves to keep them alive. This happens to be a slice through an alfalfa stem, but it nicely shows the two different types of conducting tissue. These things that look like big circles, if you could see them, they'd be shaped like big pipes. You're looking at them edge on. So imagining you have a big bundle of pipes and you're looking at them from, you're looking at them face on, you'd see a bunch of circles. It's the same thing here. These circles are pipe-shaped cells of a type called xylem. And by the way, xylos is Greek for wood, as in a xylophone, which is, well, phono means sound. So a xylophone is wood that makes a sound. And then these other cells down here transporting sugars, sugars in a solution of water, AKA sap. And the cells down here that are doing that are a type called phloem. So xylem carries water, typically from the roots up. Phloem carries sap, typically from the leaves down. And between the xylem and the phloem, every part of a healthy plant gets access to water and access to nutrients. Nice how that works out. And wood, by the way, is basically almost entirely xylem tissue. The phloem in a tree, the wood is pretty much all xylem. The phloem is basically the inner layer of bark. If you were to take, people used to do this in the old days. If you take a tree and you use an axe and you cut a complete ring of bark away from the trunk of the tree, you'll kill it. Because what you've done is blocked the flow of, you've blocked the flow of nutrients from the leaves to the roots because you've gotten rid of the phloem. If you damage the phloem on a tree, you can kill it that way. So in a tree, the phloem's the inner bark, the xylem is the wood. In this alfalfa stem, you have bundles of both xylem and phloem together. The same in celery. If you've ever eaten celery and you ended up with these little strings in your teeth, those strings are basically made up of xylem and phloem bundled together. They're what we call vascular bundles. So there. Okay, the last kingdom is the Animalia, and I'm not going to finish it because I've only got 9 minutes to go. But I'll talk a little bit about what animals are. And when I say the word animal, most of you think of mammals. I used to do this, I would ask people to write down as many animals as they could. And what everybody goes for is the familiar pets and, farm animals, all the ones that you learned in kindergarten. So people write down dog, cat, horse, cow, goat, sheep, goldfish, etc. Those are the familiar ones. And so it's no surprise here that this snow leopard, Uncia, is an animal, a very adorable one that would kill you and eat you if it could. But people don't always realize that not all animals are furry and have big, beautiful eyes and would eat you. By far, the largest phylum in the kingdom Animalia is called the Arthropoda, and that includes crabs and lobsters and shrimp and spiders and scorpions and ticks and insects. So the common whitetail, which by the way is one species you can see around here. I used to get them in my backyard all the time, Libellula lydia. This is also an animal. And so is the glow-in-the-dark sea pen, Pennatula phosphorea, shown here growing on the ocean floor. And you may be amazed that we call this thing an animal because it looks like a freaking plant. I mean, look, it's got a stem, it's got leaves, Okay, it's kind of weird because it's squishy and it glows in the dark, but this does not look like what most of you would think of if I said the word animal. So how is this thing an animal? Well, first of all, they're multicellular and they have cell differentiation. And again, the simplest animals, the very simplest might only have 4 different types of cell. You've got roughly 200. Something like a fly would have maybe 55 different types of cell. But that's cell differentiation for you, different types that do different things. Generally, animals are heterotrophic. Remember that tropho means to feed and hetero means other or different. So if you are heterotrophic, you have to feed on other living things as a source of the energy to run your metabolism and the nutrients that you need to build up your own molecules. So you, for example, have to eat plants, and probably most of you eat animals or animal products as well. That's being a heterotroph. Most animals at least some stage of their life cycle are able to move. They're motile. Plants, not so much. With the exception of some of the simplest, like sponges, animals are usually symmetrical in some way, which means that your bodies can be divided into mirror image halves. So if we go back to this dragonfly, I would never do such a thing to such a beautiful creature, but we could, in theory, cut it right down the middle and divide its body into halves that are exactly the same shape, but mirror images of each other. With a sufficiently sharp samurai sword, I could do the same thing to you. And I could do it to the sea pen because this one is also symmetrical. Animals don't have cell walls, but the cells are locked together by a meshwork of fibers made of proteins, notably a protein called collagen that you may have heard of. And that meshwork of fibers that locks the cells together is called the extracellular matrix. And then finally, all but the simplest animals have cells that are organized into groupings of cells called tissues, coordinated groupings of cells that are specialized for one major function. So let's see what this looks like. This happens to be a sample of human tissue, and this is called loose areolar tissue. It's the kind of thing your body uses as filler. This is the stuff that you would see if we took a piece of what's just under the skin of your cheek and stained it. We've used these stains or dyes to bring out colors because in life, this would just be kind of mostly translucent. But this is a piece of human tissue. The actual cells are shown by the dark dots. Those dark dots are nuclei. So that's a cell, and that's a cell, and that's a cell, and so on. But surrounding all of these cells is stuff that looks like blue cotton candy. And that's not made of cells. That is mostly a substance called collagen. That's a protein that makes up the extracellular matrix. Some of you may know that if, as we age, our bodies tend to lose the ability to make so much of this, and we start to sag in various places. And it's possible for a cosmetic surgeon to give you collagen injections to plump up any body parts that are sagging, like your cheeks. They can actually take collagen protein and shoot it into you and fluff up your tissues, at least it works for a while. So anyway, what they're doing is adding this injected collagen to the extracellular matrix that's already there. Okay, by the way, blood is a specialized tissue. This is a sample of human blood that's been stained and put under a microscope. And the extracellular matrix in the case of blood happens to be a liquid. The liquid part of blood is called the plasma. You might have heard of this. And then floating around in the plasma, you have cells. This right here is what we'd call a white blood cell. And you can see the nucleus very clearly. The nucleus of these guys is shaped almost like a clover. So this is one nucleus, although it's not always easy to see how it's all connected. But I promise you it's all one clover-shaped nucleus. Red blood cells carry oxygen. And in you, red blood cells don't have nuclei. They're basically just bags of a protein called hemoglobin that does the carrying of oxygen. You're still a eukaryote, though, because red blood cells come from progenitor cells in your bone marrow that do have nuclei. They just lose the nucleus as they grow and mature. And by the way, if you were a bird or a fish or a reptile, you would have nuclei in your blood cells. This is a feature that's unique to mammals, having red blood cells that haven't got any nuclei. But again, we would still call you a eukaryote, even though your red blood cells, when they are mature, don't contain nuclei anymore. All right. That's actually a pretty good place to stop. I'll start talking about the basic tissue types when we reconvene on Thursday. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.